if we're talking about Protestant denominations that split somewhere around the Civil War, the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians all split. And Methodists, that was the one that I chose to focus on for that chapter. They did reunify, although their predominantly Black jurisdictions didn't fit into that reunified scheme very well. Presbyterians did reunify and then rather quickly split again. The PCA, PCUSA division is not exactly the Northern Southern Presbyterian, but it has its roots there. And the PCA being more Southern, not just in location, but in orientation and on issues like, are there social hierarchies and should they be maintained? On race would be the older way of thinking it. Now it's more on gender. There are social hierarchies and they should be maintained. So you can hear echoes of that in the Presbyterian church now. And Baptists never. That's why you still have the Southern Baptist Convention. That was the Southern slaveholding Baptist Convention. And though no longer slaveholding, you can hear echoes of their current echoes of their past conflicts in their current ones as well.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Elesha Coffman. I really, really recommend reading this book. We were not able to cover all the subject matter in this book. It's broken down into different sections of church history within American history. But as this comes up in the interview, the chapter does not really center or focus only on a single event. It looks at pretty broad strokes of American church history. So I think you would definitely be doing yourself a favor to pick up a copy of this book and give it a good read. It's very helpful. And then after that, go pick up Mark Noll's Turning Points, which is an even bigger picture of church history. And I believe that one is probably about 20, 25 years old. So that said, I really enjoyed this conversation. This was one that as I was reading and preparing, I was very, very excited and looking forward to it. And I hope it did a good job here. So if you have any feedback for me, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. If you want to hear episodes early and be able to watch the full interview in video as well as listen in audio, become a supporter at patreon.com. Just use the link that's in the show notes. Yeah, I think that's all for introduction. So no more yapping from me. Enjoy my conversation with Elesha Coffman. Elesha Coffman, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jared. I'm glad to be here.
This is really exciting. I'm a big fan of the original Turning Points, and I'm not trying to attribute this as a sequel, but obviously there's some connection to the Mark Noll book. But before we get into that, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a professor of history at Baylor University. My main research area is 20th century U.S. church history, especially print media and periodicals. I was a magazine editor before I went to grad school, so I'm drawing on that background for my research. But the Turning Points book is much more wide-ranging than that. I had to explore lots of new areas of scholarship to be able to write that one. And it is in many ways a sequel and partner volume to Mark Noll's, so we can talk about that.
I mean, that's fair if you say it, but I don't want to make your work as a scholar sound like it's only legitimate because of a connection to another scholar. We're a different generation than him. But the book is Turning Points in American Church History, How Pivotal Events Shaped a Nation and a Faith. So kind of right out of the gate, how did you land on doing this particular project?
Yes. My job before Baylor was at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. And I was the
lovely city.
It is a lovely city. And it has a ski resort. You would not think you could ski in Iowa, but in fact you can.
I did not know that. I knew about Eagle Point Park.
Eagle Point Park, also lovely. The bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Yes, it is probably the hilliest part of Iowa, right there
I
in Dubuque.
Sorry, I don't normally interrupt. I mute my mic, but I will interrupt to gush over Dubuque. So I'm going to mute again and let you finish. Go on.
Okay, I was teaching church history at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. Every fall was early and medieval. Every spring was Reformation, modern, Europe, and U.S. church history. And we had 12-week semesters. So I was supposed to get from the Reformation all the way to the present in 12 weeks. And I really needed a book that could do a creditable job of U.S. church history, which where I was trained, Duke, that was a whole semester class. That was the one that was taught by my advisor, Grant Wacker. And so I knew that that was really relevant material for people who were training to do pastoral ministry in the United States. And there wasn't really a curricular place for that at Dubuque at all. And I thought if there was something like Mark Knoll's Turning Points book just for American church history, I could put that in at the last 2, 3 weeks of the semester, get a lot of coverage, get a lot of different topics out on the table, not exhaustive at all, but give these students a grasp of the ministry context that they were entering and maybe a book that they could use with adult education in churches. And I asked Mark, who had been one of my mentors. I went to Wheaton for undergrad, although I was not a history major. I thought I hated history. I was English lit and communications. After graduation, when I found myself editing Christian History magazine and I had to take some classes in Christian history so I would know something about it, I took Mark Knoll's church history class in which he used his then new Turning Points book. So I knew this was a book that worked well in that format. I asked Mark, are you going to do one for American church history? He had no plans to do so. I asked the publisher, is there going to be another in this series? They had no plans to do so. And so then it became, well, if I want this book to exist, I'm going to have to write it. And that was, I started writing the Turning Points book when I was at Dubuque, just working feverishly over the summers because that was the time that I had. And then right in the middle of that, I took this job at Baylor. And then Baylor wanted me to write a different second book for tenure and promotion. So I put Turning Points on pause, researched and wrote A Spiritual Life of Margaret Mead, came back to Turning Points. So I no longer teach the class for which it would be useful, but that class still exists at Dubuque. There are still lots of contexts where it can be used. So it's really for seminary, undergraduate, or church use, the same as Mark's Turning Points book, that it's meant to be accessible but thought-provoking.
I think this feels like it's the only book about American history that Mark Knoll didn't write, as it applies to like and look, my listeners have heard me, and if you haven't, go back and listen to the Mark Knoll episode. Me just swooning over him. I've been reading him since I was a teenager. I love his books. And I think I neglected to ask him. So I don't think there may have been a question about this in there, but I'm not going to drop this ball this time. So this came up in his America's book, The History of the Bible in America, the distinction between contingency and inevitability. And that also comes up, I believe, in the civil rights chapter of your book, that American history is contingent and should be understood that. Can you explain that?
Yes. When we teach in the discipline of history, I'm trying to jot them down because it will be bad if I can't remember them. Some of us use the 4 C's of history, and some people have 5 C's. But when you're trying to teach students that history is not this unchanging repository of facts, and our only interaction with it is to memorize it and regurgitate it. This is why I hated history, because that was how history had been taught to me. It was names and dates about wars and presidents, and I couldn't understand why that was going to matter to me. It was just things to memorize. But historical thinking, so at least 4 of the C's, change over time. Historians are always looking at what changes over time and what stays the same. The context for any event or person or document. Complexity. Things are not simple. It's not this names and dates. There's one interpretation. There's one reason for the significant. There's complexity about it. And then contingency. And this tends to be the hardest one for students to wrap their head around. It could have been otherwise. Now, there are some events or trends in history that there's so much momentum going toward them that you couldn't even really draft a counterfactual. Something like, I think the American Civil War was going to happen somehow. These forces, these regional divisions, the battle over slavery, like that was going to happen. But there were all these compromises kicking the can down the road. It could have happened earlier. It could have happened differently. There's the contingency. It could have been otherwise. We could have started fighting that in the 1820s or 30s or 40s rather than the 60s. Maybe we could have kicked the can down further. Maybe secession could have been successful and we'd have a divided country that then had to maybe or not reunite later. It could have been otherwise. Human choices mattered. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to teach that is that that helps students and readers now understand that our choices still matter, that it's not that these historical forces are like freight trains and there's nothing you can do to stop or alter them. Sometimes they feel that way, and sometimes, despite our best collective actions, terrible things still happen. But the idea that it could have been otherwise in the past, there was something at stake for people. They weren't just observers of these freight trains of history. There's still something at stake for us now, and we're not merely observers either.
Um, I'll try to not do this, but I will say too much. I'm hoping this will be the last time. The juxtaposition between Noel's turning points and yours for me is a lot of the stuff that comes like later on in the book is what caught me off guard. There are things I didn't know or things I didn't consider. But for yours, it's like from the very first chapter, I was like, "What? This is where we're starting." Can you So it's can you go into that? Explain what I'm talking about, because I'll just ramble if I go into it.
So yeah, my lineup of turning points, it is idiosyncratic. It did start with a phone call with Mark Knoll from my basement in Dubuque saying, if you would have written a turning points in American church history, what events would you have talked about? And I had notes, and that's really where the lineup started. And then I diverged somewhat in various spots. And he wrote the foreword to this, and he points out a couple of the places that I diverged from his list, although I had reasons. Yeah, starting with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Nobody expects the Spanish Armada in this. And that was entirely because of my own class that I was teaching at Dubuque. I would have just talked about the English Reformation, and so this was like passing the ball from that unit in my class to the next one. What aspects of the English Reformation and these um, interchurch battles in the old world, how is that going to be relevant as European Christianity begins to take root in the Americas? I've been told the voyage of Columbus probably would have made more sense. And yes, it probably would have, if I had approached this book not in the context of that Reformation to US class. That probably would have made more sense. Although Columbus never set foot in what's now the United States, except Puerto Rico, which Americans constantly forget is sort of, but not also part of the United States. Spanish Armada didn't happen here either, so that it's not just disqualified or in on that rule. So yeah, it was just because for my students in that class, we would have just talked about the English Reformation. We would have just talked about how the loss of European Christendom is affecting different parts of Europe differently, either people wanting to get it back or people being glad that it's finally over. Ding dong, the witch is dead. We can do something different now. How are those battles going to be transplanted or not transplanted to the Americas?
And so I think coupling that, so the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which you're right, like it is an idiosyncratic approach, but I really enjoyed that because I don't feel like, and I didn't notice until I was well into the book, that you were really siloed in on an event. So while the chapter is, it's pointing you toward the defeat of the Spanish Armada, you do a really good job of spinning a web to help understand all of these other things. And it's kind of like, I don't know if it's high school or college, when I kind of picked up on the idea that like the American Revolution was not just this thing that was in the air that just happened. And this goes to the inevitability versus contingency thing. There's all kinds of um, like commercial and political changes. And then, within the last 5 years, reading David Graeber talking about like a lot of the ideas on freedom and independence that we have came to Europe from the New World, and then they came back to the New World in a European form, and all of that gets wrapped up. And what I really do love is that it's not just that one event, that first chapter, it's all of the chapters. So it's not simply that you're talking about the firebombing or burning of a church, and that which is a landmark event, and you could absolutely write an entire book on that, but you show us how that is connected to everything that happens and transition points. So there's no question there. I'm really just saying I really enjoyed the way that you wrote the book, and I can see an English and communications major in there.
And a journalist.
And sorry, I didn't mean to take anything away, but yeah,
Oh,
journalism. Yeah.
yeah, I found myself really recalling my years as editor of Christian History magazine, when every quarter we would produce an issue on a different topic. It was a quarterly thematic, and trying to take a pretty full-orbed look at that event, both by design and necessity. The Turning Points book does that too. And this is, I think, a little bit different between Mark's book and mine. Ironically, he was working with a much longer trajectory, like all of church history. But in some ways, if you were to draw it was a little bit more linear, because he had this sense of what church was, and what sort of the turning points in the church's story were. And both because I'm working with a shorter time frame, where the complexity, it graphs like sort of smooth out if you stretch them out so much, but if you zoom in on a smaller part, it looks more jagged. That was part of it. I also, theologically, I'm less confident in my ability to identify what the church is and where it's going than Mark has been, at least at portions of his career. I don't know about now. I haven't had this conversation with him for a while. I was tracking a really complicated, messy, and different arcs. Like, what part of why the Catholicism gets kind of sequestered in its own chapter is that the Catholics in America were on such a different trajectory than Protestants, because of when they came in large numbers, who got to set the terms for church state, or like what does it look like to have a congregation in the United States legally, and in the formation of the people, what does church leadership look like here? Like, they didn't get to set the terms of that. They had to deal with terms that were already set. So my turning points, because I wasn't tracking one line necessarily, it was harder to say this point is where this line changed. I had all these different arcs bouncing all over the place. And so my turning points are often a hook to hang a lot of information on. There was something big happening in this era. I am going to, for convenience, to pin it here. But I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about how we got to there and where it goes and what else was happening at the same time. So yeah, it was both by design and accident that I had to fill out the story around my points more, because of the mass and complexity of information that I was trying to convey.
And for listeners who haven't read Turning Points, he's really going across like she said, the big beats. So it's more of an arc, and it doesn't have, whereas this book is more granular, and avoiding, I think, here's a chapter on this subject, but looking at it as what were people doing or what were people thinking, instead of just, and I'm not saying he did this, but I think the Council of Nicaea is an idea, and it's so far back, it's hard for us to know with the same level of detail that we can the splits in what was it, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches. And I don't think I realized, I grew up Southern Baptist, but I don't think I realized until I was an adult, they never mended those fences. in the Baptist Church, whereas the others did. Is that correct?
Yes, if we're talking about Protestant denominations that split somewhere around the Civil War, yeah, the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterians all split, and Methodist, that was the one that I chose to focus on for that chapter. They did reunify, although their predominantly Black um, jurisdictions didn't fit into that reunified scheme very well. Presbyterians did reunify and then rather quickly split again. The PCA PCUSA division is not exactly the Northern Southern Presbyterian, but it has its roots there. And the PCA being more Southern, not just in location, but in orientation and on issues like, are there social hierarchies and should they be maintained? On race would be the older way of thinking it. Now it's more on gender. There are social hierarchies, and they should be maintained. So you can hear echoes of that in the Presbyterian Church now. And yeah, Baptist never. That's why you still have the Southern Baptist Convention. That was the Southern slaveholding Baptist Convention, and though no longer slaveholding, yeah, you can hear echoes of their current echoes of their past conflicts in their current ones as well.
An exercise. So I'm a history major, and which
Good
I don't know
for
if you've
you.
listened. I don't know if you've listened to the podcast, but so it's a guy with some college in quotes and a day job. So I'm still working on the college thing. But
Okay.
one of the things that I realized as I was sitting in higher college level classes is like, and we'll just use the term racism. But if you want to, if you took a piece of paper and it doesn't matter what year you pick, but you know you can say 1619, and like you start over here on the left side of the paper and you drag your pencil to the right. When would you pick it up to say that? So I'm bringing that up because no, the Southern Baptist Convention does not still, to my knowledge, actively promote chattel slavery.
Right.
However, that beginning point is a helpful starting point to show us a through line of how we got to who they are now and the conflict. And so using them as an example, just because they're a big target and, you know, seems like they kind of want our attention, but using that as a through line to get from there to here,
Mm-hmm.
it's not surprising that they're making the arguments that they're making. Like what would be surprising is if they were somehow like the inheritors of the progressive, you know, 19th 20th century's progressive type thoughts on social justice. If we were hearing that, that would truly be a weird reform. But what we have is not weird when we look at where it came from. And I feel like there's so many points in your book that like, yeah, what we have is not weird because of where it came from. Do you think that resonates with what you were trying to say in the book?
Yes, very much. As a U.S. historian who mostly writes about the U.S., my starting point is almost always why is what I'm seeing, why is the present the way it is, the built environment, the race and gender relations, the power structures, the economic structures. Um, and undergraduate students, some of them are not really interested in that. They what they want from their history class is more like, this is going to sound disparaging, but more like why people read fantasy literature. Like, oh, I want to learn about the Crusades because it's so utterly different than now. Oh, I want to learn about ancient Rome or whatever because it's so utterly different. Whereas my interest in history is always much nearer to wherever I am. Why is this building here? Why is it called this? Why is it this size? Why is it at this institution? Why do we do here what we do here? That's the part that interests me, and I'm glad that that was evident in the book, that this was more of a, oh, I can see how we got to where we are now based on what happened before.
What I do think it, there is kind of a sharp departure though. So like when you look at the Scopes trial, and why am I blanking on his name? I was just thinking about his name. He ran for president like 80 million times.
William Jennings Bryan. Yes,
William Jennings Bryan.
at least
So,
four, which is like 80 million.
well, it feels that. So when you're reading like Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson biographies, and it's like, oh, so yeah, well, it's 4 volumes that thick for
Oh,
listeners, and I
why
don't
I
know.
have not read them.
Oh, they're so good. They're so good. And it's like, I mean, Sam Rayburn gets a chunk, but like William Jennings Bryan won't go away. Um, but there are, and now I'm blanking on another name I wanted to bring up, but there are people historically, like, okay, so he was part of a left coalition, whether that's in the populist movements of the 19th into the 20th century, but there's reason to believe he very much would not have been today. And where you end off is Christianity, I guess, becoming conservative is kind of, but it was not always thus. That is not a perennial state of things. That he very much, the people will not be crucified on a cross of gold. These are things we may hear again from evangelical movement leaders, but we have not heard. I'm 41. I'll be 42 before too long. I'm middle-aged. I've never heard those things in most of the churches that I spent my life growing up in. And so I think that the fact that there are people, and I don't know, man, I feel so silly that I'm I'm blanking on this name, but he was kind of a right-wing thinker who would criticize William Jennings Bryan from Maryland,
H.L.
from Baltimore.
Mencken.
H.L. Mencken, yes. There's a very sorry, I look like I
This is
surprised
a
you.
fun game. I like this.
So at the time, H.L. Mencken thought he was something of a buffoon, and I would say if they were alive today with their same brains, they would probably be in the same coalition.
Right. The political realignments, I sometimes have told students that because it blows their mind that Republicans were the party of Lincoln and emancipation and Reconstruction. And I'm like, political parties are a little bit like if you've moved a lot of times and you have these old cardboard boxes and you keep putting different things in them each time and sort of relabeling them, like there's some sort of shell that kind of stays the same, but the contents are very fungible and the constituencies are, they can shift all the time. You have to get out of the mindset that the South always votes Republican because they're conservative, because you cannot understand the 1880s or the 1890s if that's what you think about it. And Mencken and Bryan especially, being what would currently we would think of as so progressive on so some issues, some economic issues, some like women's rights voting issues, and then so completely conservative fundamentalist on some others like biblical literalism and stuff. Yeah, particularly I think at that transition point, the very end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that I probably first thought of when I was my dissertation and first book on the magazine, The Christian Century, knowing that the first cover, when they renamed it the Christian Century, had a picture of D.L. Moody. And within Chicago, Moody Bible Institute is like the implacable foe of the University of Chicago, where all the Christian Century guys were from. Why? How is it that they were recognizing D.L. Moody? It was part of it because he just died and he was nationally famous, but like it wasn't clear what trajectory Moody's missions and what we would now term evangelical, it wasn't clear what trajectory that was on. It wasn't clear what we would now describe as liberal modernist mainline was on. There were lots of ideas in flux. Although I would say, to your assertion that Christianity hasn't always been conservative in the United States, it's true that there have been periods and pockets of more, again, what we might think of as progressive, moving toward more rights for more people rather than holding tightly to hierarchy and a few rights for all the rights for some people and very few for others. But I do think that American Protestant laity have always been, for the most part, socially conservative and fairly simplistic in their approach to the Bible. I know that your podcast title is "It Means What It Means," and this is something from Mark Knoll too, the Scottish common sense realism and the perspicuity of Scripture. Like the Bible says what it means and means what it says. And that in a simplistic sense, almost always reinforcing existing hierarchies and prejudices. It says what it means and means what it says when it says that men should be in charge. It says what it means and means what it says when it's about people in power staying in power. And even though the Bible says lots of things that upend hierarchies, lots of things that, again, might be coded as progressive now, most human beings, not just most Christians, are kind of averse to change, and they kind of want things to stay the way they are, particularly if the way they are is working for them. So that kind of, not like staunch, principled, I'm going to back it up with books conservatism, fundamentalism, but just like I can't be bothered to think more creatively about the world. I can't be bothered to push for change that might help somebody else more than it would help me. I think that that's my understanding pretty much of human nature, and American Protestants have been human, as we all are.
Well, but all of these terms, progressive, I'm actually not comfortable with the way we use the term progressive politically now, because before that was a popular thing. I remember reading a book about millennial theology, and I was like, it was brought up that progressivism, as it was associated with Christianity, was attached to a theological proposition that was basically post millennial, and the idea of like improvement over time toward whatever the eschaton, uh, and and that at some point American Christianity shifted away from post millennial views being as popular as they were, and it was probably World War One may have been that pivot point to a more pessimistic approach to things. But when you talk about progressivism, there's that, but then conservative. Well, so I won't validate the thesis that I think is a reduced version of what I'm about to say, which is like the parties flipped. What happened is the parties polarized. So what we call, and again, I'm a middle-aged man, my whole life understanding conservative has been a form of politics that is essentially just right wing, because you could say conservative and be referring to a libertarian. You could be referring to a neoconservative. You could be a paleo, whatever. It's a catch-all term in the same way that since Roosevelt, liberal has been a catch-all term for center left type people. So all of that, but these terms, the way we apply them would not have applied to a more sectionally minded mid to, going backward to the early 20th century or even before form of American politics that was driven by so sectionalism or economic interests. And in the South, say, I think people who were wealthier, their economic concerns were the ones that won out in Southern politics. And then in the Midwest, it was, over time more popular. So, but we don't have to worry about that because the parties are ready-made coalitions that are already polarized where we are right now. But that's not always been the case, has it?
The party coalitions, no, have changed a lot. And when back in something like William Jennings Bryan's era, when you were trying to make an alliance between farmers and urban laborers, and the farmers were still immigrant stock because almost all Americans are white Americans, but yeah, that was always a coalition that in some ways their economic interests aligned, but in cultural ways, like a Kansas farmer and somebody in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle Meatpacking, like, yes, they're economically connected. The cattle comes from the heartland and goes to Chicago, but these guys, early on, it was only guys that mattered. They were never going to meet, and if they did, they wouldn't like each other. They would have nothing to talk about. They were maybe speaking different languages, different religions. So trying to make that into a political coalition was certainly difficult. And yes, the along what lines are people divided? Who are the leading voices in the different coalitions? How does that switch between parties in the elections? That there's something surprising going on. The old red and blue maps. I do think, though, that there's an essential orientation to either be in favor of hierarchies or to be against them. Is society set up pretty much the way it should be, or is there something deeply wrong with it? Is it pretty much okay that the people who are at the top, like, they deserve to be there either because they're favored by God or because they've been most moral, they've worked hardest, they've been in this country longest, whatever reason. Like, is hierarchy basically good, or is it basically the problem? And there's going to be a large faction of people who may be in either party. They might describe it somewhat differently depending on region or urban, rural, or something like that. Who are like, yes, hierarchy is good. And I'm going to do what it takes to preserve hierarchy. The rich should get richer and the poor should get poorer because that's the way the world is supposed to work. And then there are people with the other orientation. No, hierarchy is the problem. The rich should, like, we need to level this. We need to share the wealth. We need to share the rights more. We need to listen more to people who've been marginalized. And for, yeah, my whole lifetime, the hierarchy is good folks have been Republicans, and the hierarchy is the problem folks have been Democrats. That isn't true back to the 19th century, but groups of people with those different orientations have always existed. And then sometimes they're in play for some reason because there's something new happening sectionally, because there's the race or gender of the person running for office has changed. Something causes the people with those basic orientations to decide which is the horse I want to back here. But the basic orientations, hierarchy good, hierarchy bad, I think you can always find those in American politics.
So, real quick on the a farmer in Kansas and maybe an industrial worker forming a coalition. That's what the Wizard of Oz is about. For those of you who don't know, and I think it's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where again David Graeber he talks about that. I did not know that whole thing in the book was an allegory, but it's pretty interesting. It's about getting off or going to a bimetallic standard. But as far as the hierarchy thing goes, so while you're saying that, and obviously this is relevant to the book, so the anti-slavery movement or the abolition movement, so clearly they were trying to at least strike down one hierarchy, but then when they win, and I think this happens again after the civil rights successes of at least 1964 and 65, you start to see political realignment in like, well, we didn't mean that far. So for abolition, it's like, well, we just meant don't own them. We didn't mean they're on equal footing with us. And after civil rights, it's like, what? We just didn't want them being hit with fire hoses. We don't want our kids bused to those schools or them bused to our kids' schools. So do you think, so obviously there's like some, there's a spectrum there that like you're anti this higher. Is that a thing that still sits with us today? Well, first of all, is that an accurate assessment? And second of all, do you think that still is with us if it's true?
Again, I would describe this as the sort of latent, essential human. Don't change is scary. And if you're already in a position, if you're already at the top or even in the top half, then change is really scary because it feels like the only place you have to go is down. Equality feels like oppression to somebody who's used to privilege. So yes, the chattel slavery, not okay, but don't want any actual equality. The segregation, yeah, that seems bad, but not busing, not affirmative action, not intermarriage, because of fear of what seems like too much change, or what can be made to seem like too much change. I do have a long running beef with some other scholars about whether the kind of conservatism that we see coming post civil rights, so like new moral majority religious rights stuff, 70s, 80s, and forward, often that will get described in history as this is a reaction to the upheavals and chaos of the 60s. Well, who saw it as upheavals and chaos? When you're talking about actual urban violence, sure, I think we can agree on that. But is the emergence of Black Americans and Native Americans and women and LGBTQ individuals into the public sphere, is that a crisis or is that an opportunity? It's a crisis if you don't want them there. It's an opportunity if you're one of them and you want to be there. And how it gets perceived as crisis or opportunity, that isn't just about messaging, but powerful political media, religious voices do have an opportunity to frame that. either saying, yes, this feels new and different, but it's actually good, or this is new and different, and that's how you know it's against God's will. Conservatives frame social change as chaos that is against God's will and must be defeated. That's not the only way to frame it. That wasn't the only way that it was framed at the time, and it's not the only way to look at it historically. I won't give them credit for just responding to social upheaval and unease. I think they fomented it for their own purposes. They framed it that way because they wanted to snap the hierarchy back into place.
Yeah, it seems like it's a like everything in America, it's a ball of things that some of them are from a point of view accurate assessments. So if you think that the right social order is X and you have anything other than X, your critique from your point of view is legitimate. And well, so just looking at race, right? So if well, or any of this, so race, sex, gender, any of the things that we're talking about is uh, uh, facilitating or accommodating people's existence in the public square, and you're opposed to any change in the social order, the read of that is going to be, well, you're racist, you're homophobic, you're sexist, any of those things. And what ends up happening is that they end up talking past each other, because the person who's receiving that criticism is hearing, oh, so on with racism, oh, you think I have personal animus, which is not what I'm asserting. And the person over here does not mean personal animus. They mean you want to prohibit or restrict people from the public space. And
Mm-hmm.
they end up talking past each other. So whether that person over here saying these people should have access to the public space, it makes that contingent on being a good person, what this person over here is hearing, who's refusing to allow that, they're hearing you're a bad person, but for a different reason. And the argument just spirals out of control. And look, I know I tend to ramble, but that's a, I mean, so the criticism of slave owners enslaving people was, this is unjust. And they're saying, well, no, this is the only form of justice. And they just end up talking past each other until it gets violent, which I would say is a much worse condition than what we have right now. Fingers crossed, knock on wood. Hope I'm hoping, but the way we paint it right now is that it is so bad, but it's not really markedly different from what normal politics have always been in this country, right?
Yeah. Right now, with the assault on the separation of powers in the Constitution and I mean, I think about this all the time. Historians do. Like,
Same.
okay, let's get rid of everybody, the government we don't like, and replace them with our allies. Well, that's the spoils system that Andrew Jackson instituted, that cramming government full of your cronies and buddies, and even trying to sway the courts through your appointment. Like, yeah, that's not new. The scope and pace of it, and the overt saying, well, we have to do this. And yeah, it's not just against precedent. It's not just like bad political manners. It is actually totally against what the Constitution says, but we know better than the Constitution. The need is so urgent that we've got to do this. Even FDR, who was arguably the greatest remaker of the political system before this, he didn't say that stuff. He didn't go that far. It was always, we're going to work within the Constitution as much as possible. We're going to push the interpretation of it, but we're not going to just like take our scissors and cut out parts of it that we don't think support our power enough anymore. The pushback he got when he floated the possibility of adding to the Supreme Court justices, because the Constitution doesn't actually say how many there are, like, that was fierce. That was like, you can't change the essential structures of our system. Like, we don't, maybe I can't even articulate why we shouldn't do that, but I'm just sure we shouldn't do that. And now people are like, oh yeah, we totally need to do that. And we're not going to listen to anybody else. We're just going to do it. I have not seen that. And I don't know if there is finally going to be pushback from whom or where. Um, we've gotten really far from the book, which is unfortunately also far. I'm not a political historian. So like that disclaimer on that, my degree is in religion. But the listening to voices on the margins, or that were historically marginalized, and not letting any one group's framing of this is what's going on here in the past, that this is what this event means, that is something that I was trying to do in the book. And part of why the turning point structure is, as some of these turning points aren't really turning points, because if you listen to enough voices, what's going on and which direction are we going? Is it getting better or getting worse? It depends on who you ask. And once you recognize that anything that's a turning point could be seen as a turn for the better or a turn for the worse, then you're really in the weeds of historical complexity and context and contingency. So yeah, turning points, I play kind of fast and loose with that designation, in part because I'm committed to acknowledging it's not strictly linear unless you're willing to take one perspective. And I'm not willing, as much as I could get away from my own perspective, I'm not willing to just take one perspective on stuff.
Yeah. Hey, listeners, it is my fault when we get when we when we get so far removed from the actual the work that we're supposed to be discussing. And I'll make sure that I walk through the what each chapter is in the introduction. That's my commitment. Because look, I start the conversation, and if you say something, I'm like, that makes me think of this.
Yeah.
I am encouraged right now because recently I've been like listening to some books, and I've come across this notion in a couple of them. I don't have the titles off the top of my head right now. That the constitutional order historically, as kind of inherited from the English tradition, is much more capacious than we think of it, and not necessarily quite so married to a text. So obviously the document, the Constitution, is like our charter. But I think it's an interesting thing that the thing that was added mainly to appease anti-federalists, that enumerates rights, and even in the Ninth Amendment says, and we didn't get them all. That was the amendment process. That was initially the Bill of Rights. That it was more concerned with here's how it's going to function, and so citizenship is also capacious because the requirement is on the people to engage and take responsibility and be the ones to drive things. And so the ultimate question or answer to the question of what is the constitutional order does not stop with the Supreme Court or either of the other federal branches. It rests with the people. And I think that's an interesting blend of which all of the history that I think you cover. We're somehow a nation that wants to be radical, and we're also a nation that wants to be traditional and what we're used to. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah. And I think that we, or some of us, probably overstate our radical bona fides. Yeah. There were a few. They were always outnumbered. They usually lost.
But it is interesting to think of the idea of having a republic in the 17th century in England. That was radical. You were overthrowing the government, and now that is our everyday.
Right. And that there, I'm betraying myself as a scholar of the 20th century. My colleagues who do early America and Revolutionary era, yeah, it doesn't seem so revolutionary to me anymore. And I should appreciate that for more of what it was. Although, again, when I think of truly revolutionary in that era, Haitian Revolution, I mean, that was upending everything, including racial hierarchy and the economics of slavery all the time. And that one didn't work nearly as well. I mean, Haiti, that this is a whole other conversation, but like it depends on it compared to what? Compared to the British monarchy, for sure, American founding fathers revolutionary. Compared to Haiti, no, they're tepid. There's so much of the order that they kept intact, including the convenient fact that they got to stay on top of everything. No, like radical, semi-radical, as far as I'm going to go.
That's probably my favorite thing that anyone has said on this podcast. And sometimes I do this. I'll pull a little clip for at the very end. That's you're getting a little tag of that at the very end of this episode. Psst, radical. What you know what? I want to put a bug in your ear, because this is a question that I've had, like as a student of history. so there was this thing that was happening in my early 20s called the emerging or emergent church, and I can't find anything about it. And this is just me putting a bug in your ear about that. Write a book about that, please, because it feels like it just disappeared.
Yes. It was kind of a flash in the pan. And I remember, I think it was reviewing an article or book about it. It was more sociologists writing about it, right? Because it was happening, and historians will write about it 30, 40 years later, because that's when our tools really are best used. But if I'm remembering this right, part of what emergent church was doing was an essentially primitivist turn. Like let's go back to the beginning when churches got it right and recover these ancient practices. The problem is that there's all these accretions of churches. Their doctrines and their practices aren't pure enough anymore, and we need to get back to the pure beginning. Was that at all part of emergent, or am I conflating it with something else?
So, I mean, it seems multifaceted because it could be anything like a young person who grew up evangelical going to a Greek Orthodox Catholic or some other liturgical tradition, or then eventually what came to be with Acts 29, or a lot, here in Houston, we had Ecclesia, and then there were churches that I was a part of so it was house church. So it almost seems like the term superfood, which is just a meaningless marketing term. Uh, but for like young evangelicals who want to keep, and this is me, you don't have to agree with this, I'm responsible for saying this, who want to keep the experience of their youth group, and they want to dress the way they did at their youth group, and they want to go to church at 5 or 6 p.m. instead of getting up in the morning, but now they have kids and they're married. That's what it seems like to me.
Well, that aspect I can't comment on as much as a historian, but there was at least one sociological piece saying then this is this primitivism wanting to get back to a pure Christianity. And because it was sociologists, they traced it maybe back as far as there was the Robert Weber at Wheaton, going back to liturgical stuff. There was this move in 70s, 80s. One guy went from evangelical to Antiochian Orthodox, Peter something, converted because that was seemed as like in older ancient practices. There's got to be riches there. So like great sociologists going back to the 70s. And my comment was, this sounds a lot like the Stone Campbell movement of the mid 19th century and the Millerites and the whole primitivism Mormons. Like that was a craze back then too. This idea that you can peel away everything that doesn't work anymore, peel away the accretions of time, and go back to like, yeah, the superfood. I love that. Like the stronger, purer essence. It's going to be more compelling to young people. It's you're going back to the source, to the stream. Um,
Authentic. That was a word.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Talk to the disciples of Christ and the Seventh Day Adventists and the Mormons of the mid 19th century. Like, yes, that is a recurring pattern. So I don't know if I have any other comment on emergent church than that.
I'm more just like, why can't I find anything on that? Because I wanted to like write some papers on that or something. So just kind of transitioning toward the end. Ordinarily, what I'll ask is at the end is there anything that I didn't ask about? But there's so much of that. I'll ask this. I'll ask this instead. Are there chapters maybe that got written, got drafted, that just got left on the cutting room floor?
No, that's not how I write. Again, from my old journalism background, I write. Actually, the book was contracted for, I don't remember, maybe 20,000 words longer. And I asked the press when I was landing the plane, like, "How's this going to come in short? Is that okay?" They're like, "That's fantastic," because academic authors are always like, "Can't you give me 80,000 more words?" I'm like, "How about shorter?" They're like, "Shorter is good. People don't read that many words anymore," which is true. There were topics that I wanted to be able to get to. The 1960s was where, like, it's all happening, and I could not get it into shape. And that was the chapter that changed the most from my original plan to when I got to writing it. I wrote the chapters in order. So it was like the first 7 that I had drafted at Dubuque. It was the back half that I worked on after the hiatus and at Baylor. That was not going to be about the Birmingham church bombing, the 60s chapter. It was going to be more civil rights in a broader definition. It was hopefully going to bring in the Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration Reform of 1965, and even Vatican II, just a general opening and openness and more people and ideas being part of the public sphere. It was going to have a much more hopeful tone. I was When I got to writing that one, that was the summer of George Floyd's murder. And the way the nation was talking about the role of violence, recurrent, constant threat of violence when you're talking about race and religion in the United States. I was marching downtown Waco. My daughter was on Waco Youth Council trying to push for finally getting a memorial to the lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916. I felt that 1960s chapter needed to have violence at its heart. And so when it became centered on the Birmingham church bombing, I couldn't just throw in the Hart-Celler Act. I couldn't just throw in Vatican II. So those were topics that I really wanted to be able to talk about, that because of the Turning Points format and not wanting to crowd the timeline at any point, it just those topics didn't get the due that I thought they would. If I had written that chapter even 1 year earlier, or maybe if I had written it 15 years later, I would have felt differently. But those are really, really big topics. Huge effects on lots of forms of American Christianity. The immigration, so many immigrants post 1965 are Christians, and they're bringing forms of Christianity from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. That didn't end up getting its due in the book, as Mark Knoll pointed out in the foreword. And to not talk about Vatican II is just kind of ridiculous, but I couldn't figure out where to put it, so I didn't.
That's fair. I really like your answer that you're just like, no, I wrote what I wrote, and that's as far as like, no, there weren't things that I left out, and I've heard academics, particularly Jason Staples was one. He's a New Testament scholar, and in an SBL panel on his book, somebody was like, "Why didn't you say anything about this?" And he's like, "Well, I had an appendix, and they made me cut it." So, like, yeah, I get it. There's a struggle for academics. They have so many words, and they're not allowed to put them all in their books. So recommendations for other than your book, which absolutely, listeners, read this book. It's a good book, and it's going to be a confrontation. But in addition to that, and there's really good, what I would say, at the end of each chapter, like look to the end of each chapter for recommended reading. But what are your recommendations that you would also send people to?
Right. Oh, I will also say that there's an audio version of my book. I didn't record it. It has a professional narrator. So if podcast listeners are more interested in audiobook versions, that is also available. The main podcasts I listen to are old time radio mysteries. Like 30s, 40s, 50s, golden age of radio, golden age of mystery is what I read a lot of too. But recently I was taking a road trip up to Oklahoma, and I wanted to have some podcast episodes to listen to, unobscured. There's a season on spiritualism. Spiritualism does not come up in my book. I don't think it's really Christian, but super fascinating. And then a friend of mine, also an American church historian, David Swartz, has a podcast series called Rebel on Main, where he's investigating the history and ongoing significance of a Confederate statue in his town in Kentucky. Amazing, like including summer of George Floyd protests. Like he was collecting audio for this for a long time. Like I haven't been able to ask him, like, why did you even know when you started collecting that what you were going to use it for? This is a really long project, but totally fascinating. So that one's Rebel on Main.
Okay. So you kind of mentioned something, movements that made me think about utopianism as this uniquely American phenomenon. And there's a podcast called Nice Try, which is going through and looking at different utopian movements. I think the first season they did was on the Oneida Yeah, which I did not know the Oneida flatware or cutlery that you can get at Target or whatever is from this
Uh-huh.
weird cult, this weird sex cult. Uh,
Complex marriage. As my advisor used to say, I feel like being married to one woman is complex enough. I can't imagine how they tried to make that work.
so any other books or anything that you would throw out there other than what's in the book at the end of the chapters for recommendations?
Um, yeah, there's new scholarship coming out all the time, but that those recommended resources at the end was the best snapshot that I could give that I thought people could actually find. Not academic books that there's only 5 copies of in the U.S. or something like that. But yep, that was my attempt.
Cool. Uh, so what do you read for fun? I mean,
The
other
the
than you talked about the ultimate, but
Mostly
sorry.
the golden age of mysteries. Yeah, it makes me sad that there aren't any more Dorothy Sayers mysteries other than the ones that I've already read. She didn't write that many. They're brilliant. Agatha Christie, those are uneven, but there's lots of them. So that's sort of the center of what I look for reading, and then spinning out. I do really like reading old novels. Again, as a historian of the 20th century, I feel like I pick up a lot of sort of ambient details about that period. One of the first things I like to do when I'm going to write about a time period is find some best-selling novels from that period to hear how people talked, to hear what their assumptions about race and gender and history were. Often that's very eye-opening when that's what you're looking for. But yeah, 30s, 40s, 50s stuff I really enjoy.
Have you, and it's fine if you haven't, I'm just curious. Have you seen any of the movies that Kenneth Branagh has made of the Agatha Christie books?
Yes, a couple of them.
What do you think? You like them?
I do. In general, I'm less inclined to watch a movie version of a mystery that I already know how it ends. So, yeah, movie versions of mysteries I know, I won't necessarily seek them out, but I'll watch them on a plane and they can be quite nice.
Okay. I love Kenneth Branagh, so I just want to take an opportunity to talk about
And
Kenneth Branagh.
costumes. Love me some period costumes.
They did a good job with those. Okay, so anything else that are you a TV or a movie person?
Not a lot. My husband and I usually have like 2 or 3 TV series that we're trying to watch, and it takes us forever to get through. Somebody Somewhere. Have you ever seen Somebody Somewhere? It's
I
the
have
most.
not.
I think it's HBO. It's bawdy comedy in a lot of ways, but it's also the most mainline Protestant, like the most. Um, yeah, there's a character who is at a Presbyterian church for a while, and then he finds a new partner and they go to a Lutheran church. Yeah, it's the most sensitive portrayal of mainline Protestants on a TV screen that I've maybe ever seen.
I saw ads for that. And Bridget Everett is really funny. There's a guy I recognize him from Community. He's like a character actor who's been on all these sitcoms that I really like. Um,
Mhm,
but I never got around to watching it because I didn't know. I felt like the trailer was just the ads that I saw. It just seemed kind of nebulous, and I was like, well, I don't know what to make of that. And I watched the same 6 shows over and over again. So,
mhm.
yeah, okay, I'll check that out. Well, okay.
Yeah, it's an
Uh,
out of the box one, but I've really enjoyed it.
well, that's what I really think is the benefit of this podcast is getting outside of the box. And I thank you so much for your patience with me getting out of the box or straying off the path. So unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
No, I think this is great. Although I do want to reiterate the disclaimer: I'm not a political historian. I'm not that kind of doctor, so don't just take my political advice.
Anything wrong or bad said by either of us is my fault. How about that?
I don't think that's quite fair, but if that's
Doesn't
the disclaimer that will cover our
Yep,
our wide ranging ramblings, then I'll
yep.
take it.
Doesn't have to be fair. I'll take it. Elesha Coffman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jared. It was a great time.
Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you guys all coming back. I just want to remind you again, if you want to be able to listen to episodes early, 10 days before they come out for free, or also you want to have the choice to watch the interview use the link in the show notes and become a supporter for $5 a month at patreon.com. Yeah, next week's is interesting. It is Amy Peeler, and we're discussing her book, Women and the Gender of God, which focuses a lot on the incarnation. And if you think you know what that title means, you do not. So enjoy this quick preview, and if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it.
And so how do I know that God is Father? Well, I could look to Israel's scriptures, or maybe even before that, I could kind of look around and see, well, I see fathers. I know my own, I see others. And of course, the data there would be quite varied. There are good examples, there are bad examples. And so we could maybe draw some kind of conclusions. But I'm also deeply committed that theology doesn't work bottom up. We don't kind of look around at the human condition, especially because the human condition is tainted by sin. We're not perfect. And so we don't just look around and then say, oh, that must be what God is like. Then we project up. I think there's some very good critiques of that's what religion is, but that's not what Christianity is, because Christianity is God's revelation top down. So if I can't totally trust the pictures of fathers as I know them to really know what God is like, then I would go to the scriptures. And again, we have a handful of instances in which God elects Israel or says, I'm like a father to you and I'm adopting you. Now that happens with the individual of the king in Israel, and then a few times kind of broadly as the people. But it's always very clear that that is language that's communicating God's provision and protection for them. There's no statements of actuality there. Like Israel is very careful to say, hey, we're not kind of begotten by God. We're not sired by God. They respect the creator-creation distinction, right? Infinite qualitative divide between the creator and the creation. When you get to the New Testament, though, open up Matthew. Page 1. Then you get this statement that Jesus is the Son of God. And Luke tells the story of the Annunciation. Mary, the child that you bear will be called holy, will be called Son of God. That's when things change. Because as we are told in the New Testament, Jesus has an unparalleled relationship with God, that God is not like his Father. God is his Father eternally, and that is revealed in the incarnation. And then we say, well, how do I get into relationship with God as my Father? I would say for all humans, the only way to get into that relationship is through Jesus. So that's my answer. How do I understand God's fatherhood? I look at Jesus, because that's the way I get in.